The glass hit the marble so hard the whiskey shook. "Stop ordering me around like I belong to you." The room stopped breathing. 40 powerful men. Not one of them moved. The bodyguard's hand drifted slowly toward his jacket. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the man at the table, the one who hadn't looked at her once all evening, who had rearranged her like furniture, who had spoken in her direction the way people speak at walls, who had made her refill a glass that was already full, who had made her step forward, step back, step forward again, like she was a chair someone couldn't decide where to place. 7 minutes. She had 7 minutes left in her shift when she stopped being furniture. He looked up now. Slowly. The way a man looks up when he's deciding whether something is a problem or an opportunity. His eyes moved from the table to her face with the unhurried quality of someone who has never once in his life needed to rush, not because nothing threatened him, but because nothing had ever threatened him enough to matter. Korean. Late 20s. A face that was almost too composed to read, like a painting that had never been touched. Sharp jaw. Cold, narrow eyes with a weight behind them that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with what he'd done with his years. No anger, which was so much worse than anger, because anger she could fight. Anger she understood. This flat, measuring stillness, the complete absence of reaction from a man who had just been challenged in a room full of people who would never dare. This had no shape she could push against. The silence stretched across 40 people like a wire pulled to the edge of snapping. She heard someone exhale. She heard the distant sound of Seoul rain against the panoramic windows 42 floors above the city. She heard her own heartbeat doing something it had no business doing in a professional setting. Then he said, very quietly, barely a sound at all, barely more than breath shaped into words, "What's your name?" She stared at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she picked up her tray and walked away. Welcome to Echoverse Stories. If you're new here, please like, subscribe, and drop a comment. And stay with us through this story, because what happens next is going to change everything you thought you understood about danger and obsession. The first 3 minutes went fine. She brought the requested bottle. She poured without error. She stood at the correct angle. Tae-Hyun spoke in low Korean with 2 of his associates, occasionally glancing at documents placed on the table by one of his men. He didn't look at her once. She was furniture. She preferred it that way. Then it started. "The lighting on this side is wrong." The voice was quiet, toneless, and directed at no one in particular. But Supervisor Cho had vanished. The hostess had drifted away, and the only person within earshot was Nia. She adjusted the nearby mood lamp without comment. 3 minutes later. "This glass." She replaced it. Unused. She replaced an unused glass. Then, "The ice ratio is off." She poured a fresh drink. Then, without even a glance in her direction, as though she were a feature of the room that could simply be reconfigured by verbal command, "Stand further back. You're too close." Something tightened in Nia's chest. Not fear. Not yet. Something older and more dangerous than fear. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been treated like an object one too many times, stretched too thin across too many indignities, reaching the end of a very long rope. She stepped back. Actually, closer. "Refill the bottle." She stepped forward and refilled the bottle. "You're hovering." She stepped back again. 3 of his associates were now watching with quiet curiosity. She could feel it. The specific amusement of men watching something that they believed had no power watching itself be controlled. One of them said something low in Korean and the others smiled. Nia didn't speak Korean fluently, but she had been in Seoul long enough to understand laughter. She set her jaw. 4 minutes left in her shift. Then Tae-Hyun said, still without looking at her, "Rearrange the bottles. I want the Macallan centered." Nia put her tray down on the edge of the table. The sound was quiet but deliberate. The act of setting something down rather than holding it. An action so small it should have meant nothing. But in a room where every movement was calculated, it landed like a statement. She leaned slightly forward. No. The associate mid-sentence stopped talking. I'm a waitress, Nia said, voice low but completely steady. Not a personal assistant, not a decorator, not furniture that you move around with your voice. A pause. Stop ordering me around like I belong to you. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one that had greeted his arrival. That one had been reverence. This one was shock. Pure, cold, held breath shock. Nobody moved. In her peripheral vision, she saw one of Tae-Hyun's bodyguards take a single slow step forward, hand drifting toward his side. And then, only then, Kang Tae-Hyun turned and looked directly at her. His eyes were the problem. She'd expected anger. She'd expected the cold fury of a man whose authority had never been questioned. Instead, she found something she had no framework for. A careful, measuring interest. The way a person looks at something they have never encountered before and aren't sure yet whether it's beautiful or dangerous. Probably both. The silence stretched. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. Then very quietly, with no inflection whatsoever, he said, "What's your name?" Nia stared at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she picked up her tray and walked away. Her locker took 40 seconds to open because her hands were shaking. She didn't fully understand why they were shaking. She told herself it was adrenaline, the reasonable response to having done something unreasonable. She had talked back to a man in a room full of people who were visibly afraid of him. That was just biology, she told herself. Her nervous system catching up to what her mouth had done. Around her, the staff who had witnessed it were performing various levels of controlled panic. Ji-yeon, her section colleague, found her at the locker and grabbed her wrist so hard it hurt. Nia, listen to me. I'm fine. You don't know who that is. I don't care who that is. He was being... Kang Tae-Hyun. Ji-yeon said the name like it was a diagnosis. Do you understand me? That's not a businessman. That's not just a rich client. That man runs the Kang Syndicate. 3 families report to him. He has judges. He has police superintendents. People who cross him don't file complaints, Nia. They disappear. Nia felt the shaking in her hands become something colder. He probably doesn't even remember my name, she said. But the words felt hollow before she finished the sentence. What's your name? The way he'd said it. Like the answer mattered. Like he was going to use it. Ji-yeon's eyes were wet. Just go home fast. Take the back exit. Don't stop for anything. Nia grabbed her bag, pushed through the staff corridor, hit the service exit and stepped into the rain. The back alley behind Hanam Tower was empty. Wet asphalt. Distant city noise. She exhaled and started walking fast toward the main road where she could get a taxi. She made it 30 meters. Then the black SUVs appeared. 3 of them, pulling up in a silent convoy that blocked every available direction of movement without a single tire screech. The engines cut. The doors opened. 4 men stepped out, and these were not the ordinary kind. These were the kind whose presence made the night feel smaller, whose faces gave away nothing because they had been trained to give away nothing. The one closest to her was built like architecture. He didn't reach for her, didn't threaten her. Just stepped forward, opened the rear door of the center vehicle and said in clean, accented English, "Mr. Kang requests your presence." Nia looked at the open door, then at the man, then at the 3 vehicles blocking her exit. "I'm not getting in that car." The man said nothing. He simply waited. The rain came down harder. "Tell him," she started. "Mr. Kang requests your presence," he said again. Identical delivery. Like a recording. Nia calculated. She was in an alley, It was past midnight. There were 4 of them, and she had a mostly empty handbag and a bad history with confrontations tonight. She thought about running. She thought about screaming. She thought about both of those things and understood, with the specific clarity of a woman who has lived in several cities and knows when a situation has moved past negotiation, that she had no real options. She got in the car. They took her phone before the SUV started moving. Politely. A hand extended, palm up, waiting. She placed it there because something in the quality of that waiting told her they would take it either way, and this was an offer of dignity. The windows were privacy glass, dark on all sides. She couldn't see the city outside, couldn't track the route, couldn't know if they were going 3 blocks or 30 kilometers. Nobody spoke. She could hear her own breathing. She tried to apply logic to the situation. He wanted to talk to her. That was it. He wanted to understand what had happened, or perhaps to establish that such a thing would never happen again. He was a powerful man, and powerful men don't like anomalies. She had been an anomaly tonight, and he wanted to correct it. He would speak to her. She would apologize if necessary. She would go home. That's what she told herself for the first 7 minutes. Then the convoy turned, and through the front windshield, the only glass that wasn't blacked out, she glimpsed the building. It rose out of the city like something that had always been there and always would be. A tower of dark glass and sharp angles that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The kind of building that didn't need a sign because everyone who needed to know already knew. Private underground entrance. The vehicles descended into it. Inside, marble floors, security cameras in every corner, 4 guards at the elevator bank, biometric panels, the hum of systems designed to contain and control. Everything beautiful, and everything a cage. The elevator ascended without her pressing a button. The doors opened on the penthouse floor. The space beyond was enormous and dark. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides giving the illusion of floating above Seoul, the city spread out below like a circuit board lit from within. The furniture was minimal and expensive. There were no photographs, no personal items, nothing that revealed a life lived here. Just the clean, controlled atmosphere of a man who allowed himself no softness. Tae-Hyun stood at the far window, back to her, looking down at the city. He had changed his jacket. He held a glass of whiskey. He didn't turn around immediately. Nia walked in because standing in the elevator felt worse. "You kidnapped me," she said. He turned then, and she was struck again, almost against her will, by the quality of his attention. He looked at her the way few people in her life had ever looked at her. Like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. Not in desire, but in absolute focus. "You were escorted," he said. "That's not what that was. You were brought here safely. Nobody touched you. You weren't harmed. I'm being held against my will in a stranger's penthouse in the middle of the night. You're a guest. Guests can leave." Something passed across his face. Not quite amusement. Not quite anything she could name. He set his glass down on the marble surface beside him. "Sit down," he said. "No." Another pause. He seemed to be collecting her responses the way someone catalogs unexpected weather patterns. Fascinating, but also something to be calculated around. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It was an observation, not a compliment. "I didn't say that." "You're not behaving like someone who's afraid." "I'm from Lagos," Nia said flatly. "We don't have time to perform fear. We just figure out what to do next." This time, something actually moved in his expression, just briefly, just at the corner, before it was gone. "Sit down," he said again. "Please." The please surprised her enough that she sat. The dinner appeared without her asking for it. A staff member, she hadn't even seen another person in the penthouse, materialized from some corridor and placed covered dishes on the long dining table with the practiced silence of someone who understood that visibility was a liability here. The food was extraordinary. She could smell it from across the room. Nia sat at the far end of the table. Tae-Hyun sat at the head. The distance between them felt theatrical. She stared at the food and did not touch it. Not because she wasn't hungry. She was starving. She hadn't eaten since a small meal 8 hours ago. But eating the food felt like an agreement to something, and she wasn't ready to agree to anything. Tae-Hyun watched her not eat. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, without drawing attention to what he was doing, he reached across and switched their plates. Simply moved his full plate to her side and pulled her untouched one in front of himself. No comment. No eye contact. As if it hadn't happened. As if to say, this isn't a transaction. This is just food. She stared at his plate in front of her. She picked up the chopsticks. She ate. And somewhere in the act of eating food that someone had quietly given her without demanding gratitude for it, something shifted. Not trust, not even close to trust, but the very first tiny fracture in the wall of pure terror she had been holding since the alley. "Why am I here?" she asked. "Because you saw too much." "I saw a man eat dinner. I saw a table full of people have a meeting." "You saw their faces," he said. "At that table? You heard things." "I hear things every shift. I don't." "You heard them at that table specifically. That's different." She set down the chopsticks. "So what? You're going to keep me here forever because I refilled someone's whiskey?" "No," he said. And the word was clean and immediate, with no equivocation in it. "Until we determine that it's safe for you to move freely." Safe for me. Or safe for you. This time he didn't answer, which was, she understood, its own kind of answer. They gave her a room that was larger than her entire apartment, white walls, clean sheets, a view of the city that should have been beautiful, but at this moment felt like looking at something she had lost access to. She couldn't sleep. She lay on top of the covers in her work clothes and stared at the ceiling and ran through every possibility. In the morning, she tested each exit methodically. The main elevator required a palm scan. The service staircase was guarded. The second elevator bank required a key code. Every corridor had cameras, and each one had at least one man stationed in it who would materialize the moment she moved too far in any direction. She was not chained. She was not threatened. She was absolutely, completely, luxuriously imprisoned. The guards were polite. They brought her breakfast. They showed her the wardrobe that had been stocked. She didn't want to think about when or by whom, with her approximate size. They told her she could use the library, the gym, the upper terrace, and the dining room. They told her all of this in the friendly tone of people describing the amenities of a very expensive hotel where the front door doesn't open. Tae-Hyun himself was absent for most of the day. She heard him twice. A door, a low voice, phones, but didn't see him. She spent the day listening. This was something she had learned in Lagos, refined in Seoul. The specific skill of listening without appearing to listen. Of sitting in a library reading a book while absorbing the conversation happening in the hallway outside. She couldn't understand most of it, but she caught patterns, names, tonal shifts. She caught the specific electricity that ran through the staff when they talked about certain things, a tension that indicated importance, a lowering of volume that indicated danger. By evening, she had assembled a rough picture. Kang Tae-Hyun was not simply a criminal, he was a criminal ecosystem. He controlled logistics networks, financial channels, construction contracts, import infrastructure. He had relationships with government officials that went both directions. He protected them, and they protected him. 3 rival organizations existed in a constant Cold War with his syndicate. Someone, a specific someone, had been making moves on his territory for the past several weeks. She was not supposed to know any of this. The question was why knowing it made him want to keep her close rather than make her disappear entirely. Because if he were the kind of man she was initially afraid he was, disappearing her would have been far simpler. So either she was wrong about what kind of man he was, or she was missing something. She was missing something. The attack came at 2:17 in the morning. She heard the glass before she understood what it was. A sharp high crack, then an eruption, and then she was on the floor because someone had grabbed her and she was being held down, and there was shouting in Korean all around her. The thunder of footsteps, voices sharp with command and urgency. She looked up from the floor. Tae-Hyun was above her, his body between her and the shattered panoramic window. Glass had exploded across the room. Somewhere outside, in the city below, a sniper's second shot embedded in the wall, 3 inches from where she'd been standing. He had crossed the room in the time it took for her to register the sound. Guards were everywhere now. She had no idea where they'd come from, how so many men had appeared in seconds. They moved with the practiced geometry of people who had trained for exactly this. Tae-Hyun kept his body low and angled over her until 2 guards flanked him. Then he rose and began speaking in sharp Korean, completely calm, issuing instructions with the businesslike manner of someone managing a logistics problem, not a crisis. The city lights glittered through the broken window. Cold air poured in. Nia was still on the floor, breathing in pieces. She looked at her hands and they were covered in tiny glass fragments. Nothing deep. Nothing serious. She looked up at Tae-Hyun, who was now moving across the room with 2 guards, and she realized he was bleeding. A thin line along the side of his neck. From glass or fragment. Shallow, but real. He hadn't flinched. Not once. That was the thing that settled into her like cold water. The complete, almost inhuman absence of panic in a man who had just been shot at. No adrenaline shaking. No raised voice. Just the flat, functional calm of someone to whom danger was the permanent landscape of existence. He lived here. Inside threat. Inside this. And he had put his body between her and the window before she had even processed the sound. She didn't know what to do with that. He came to her room 2 hours later. Knocked, which she hadn't expected. She opened the door and he was standing there without his jacket, the shallow wound on his neck cleaned and closed with a small strip of tape. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Small cuts. From the glass. Nothing serious." She looked at his neck. "You?" "Nothing." She stepped back. He came in. He sat. Not on the chair nearest the door as someone performing detachment would, but on the edge of the window seat, looking at the city. She stood near the wall with her arms folded. "Who is that?" she asked. "A message? From the people you were meeting with tonight? The ones whose faces I saw?" "No." He paused. "From a rival organization. They've been watching this building. Tonight they chose to act." "Because of what? Some new territorial problem?" He looked at her then, and there was something complicated in that look. The first real complexity she'd seen from him that he hadn't immediately contained. "Partially," he said. "What's the other part?" He was quiet for a moment. "There are people who believe that identifying what matters to me is a useful weapon." Nia felt the sentence land. She unfolded her arms. "I've been here for 2 days. Yes. You're saying that they already... I'm saying that information moves quickly in certain circles, and that I underestimated how quickly." She looked at him for a long moment. "So, I'm not just trapped here because I heard things. I'm trapped here because being seen with you makes me a target." "Yes." "Then let me go. If I leave, I stop being relevant." "If you leave," he said quietly, "they take you to get to me, and I can't protect you outside of this building." The words were simple and flat, and the worst part was that she believed them completely. "So I'm stuck here," she said, "because you couldn't leave me alone after a minor argument in a lounge." Something moved in his jaw. Not quite a reaction. Something suppressed. "You said stop ordering me around like I belong to you," he said. She stared at him. "Nobody has ever said anything like that to me," he continued. "Not in years. Not since—" He stopped, closed whatever had been opening. "You weren't afraid. Everyone in that room was afraid. You looked at me and you just—" "I was exhausted," she said. "Yes. That wasn't bravery. That was someone at the end of a very long week." "I know," he said. "That made it more real." She stared at him across the quiet room, the city glowing behind him, and she thought, "This is the most dangerous situation I have ever been in, and the reason it's dangerous is no longer what I thought it was." "Tell your people to keep watch tonight," she finally said, "and fix your window." He almost smiled. He left without another word. The days developed a rhythm she hadn't expected. She woke early. She moved through the penthouse, or the parts of it she was permitted to. And she watched, and she learned. Tae-Hyun ran his organization from the upper level, a space she wasn't supposed to access, but she could hear the activity of it. Phones, meetings, quiet, sharp voices, and the specific silence after decisions were made. She was fed extraordinary food. She was left alone when she wanted to be alone. She was never followed inside the penthouse itself, only monitored at the exits. And sometimes, not often, but with a frequency that increased, Tae-Hyun would find her. Not seek her out, exactly, but appear in the same space. He'd sit in the library when she was there, reading documents, not addressing her, until she said something first. They'd eat dinner across that too long table and she'd push at some topic. The city, the food, the architecture. And he'd respond in the measured way of a person unaccustomed to being asked questions that weren't strategic. She learned. He had grown up in Busan. He had been in Seoul since he was 17. He had never lived anywhere else because there was always something here that required his attention. He slept 4 hours a night. He ate the same breakfast every morning. He had never in his adult life watched a film purely for entertainment. She laughed at that last one, genuinely, without meaning to. He looked startled. "What's funny?" he asked, not offended, actually asking. "I've never met a person who doesn't watch films. That's like saying you don't breathe." "It's not like saying you don't breathe. It's in the same category of essential human experiences." "What category is that?" "The one that reminds you that the world is larger than whatever problem you're currently managing." He looked at her for a moment, then said, "I'll think about that." And she knew, from the specific quality of his voice, that he actually would. But nothing stayed safe. 3 weeks in, one of his inner circle leaked her name and her face to a rival network. She learned this not from Tae-Hyun directly, but from a conversation she overheard between 2 guards, their voices low and sharp with the specific fury of people who understood what the breach meant. That evening, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted. More men. Closer proximity. Tae-Hyun's manner, already controlled, became something harder and more contained, like a current running stronger beneath the same surface. He told her at dinner, "Someone in my organization talked. About me. About you." She set down her glass. "How bad?" "They know you're here. They know your name. They know you came from Lagos." A pause. "They know you matter." The last 2 words sat between them like something that had been said out loud for the first time. She didn't address them directly. "What does that mean for me?" "It means we can't move you. Moving you right now would expose you during transit, and that's when they strike. So you stay here." "I've been staying here. I mean, you don't go to the terrace. You don't approach the windows in the visible rooms. You eat in the interior dining room. You don't. You're shrinking my world even further. I'm keeping you alive. The words were flat and immediate, not cruel, just facts. Delivered by someone who deals exclusively in facts. She pushed back from the table slightly. What happened to the person who leaked? Tae-Hyun looked at her steadily. You don't want to know that. She held his gaze for a long moment. She thought of Ji-yeon in the locker room, of the way she'd grabbed her wrist and said people who cross him disappear. She thought of the man she'd been watching for 3 weeks, who was in turns frightening and fascinating and occasionally, in small, unguarded moments, almost unbearably human. No, she agreed. I probably don't. The night he took her to the underground club, he told her it was for security reasons. There's a meet happening here tonight, he said. Keeping you at the penthouse while I'm absent creates a window. This is safer. She wore the dress that appeared on her bed that afternoon, deep green, structured, clearly chosen by someone with an actual eye. And she walked beside him into a space that made Obsidian look like a casual bar. Underground, private, the entry unmarked from the street. The kind of venue that existed in the deep tissue of the city's criminal infrastructure, known only through relationships and passed down access. The moment they walked in together, the room saw them. She felt it. The specific quality of a room's attention shifting. Conversations pausing to recalibrate. Eyes that moved from him to her and back. Whispers she couldn't hear but could feel. She caught the word in Korean several times, and later she would learn it meant his woman, which made her angry and complicated and confused all at once. Tae-Hyun kept close to her in the way of a man who was performing nonchalance and not quite achieving it. He spoke to men. He shook hands. He was in his element. Controlled, commanding, each interaction precisely measured. Then 3 men from the rival network sat down at a table nearby. She noticed them noticing her first. The quality of that attention was different from everyone else's. Not curiosity, but calculation. One of them stood and walked toward her. He said something in Korean, voice casual, almost charming. He smiled. Before she could respond, Tae-Hyun was beside her. She hadn't seen him move. One moment he was 3 meters away. Then he was there, between her and the man, and the temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees in about 1 second. He said something quiet in Korean. She caught only 2 words, and the man looked at him, then at her, then back at him, and walked away. The entire club had gone still. Tae-Hyun put a hand on the small of her back, lightly, briefly, and guided her toward a private table. She waited until they sat. What did you say to him? She asked. Nothing important. The whole room reacted. He picked up his drink. The context was important, not the words. She stared at him. You're possessive. He said nothing. I'm not yours, she said. I know that, he said. Your behavior does not know that. He was quiet for a moment. He set his glass down precisely and looked at her. And there it was again. That quality of complete, undefended attention that undid her in ways she spent a lot of time refusing to acknowledge. When that man walked toward you, he said, he wasn't coming to talk. He was coming to send me a message by touching what I'm connected to. I'm not. I know what you are. What I'm telling you is what he saw, and what he was prepared to do. A pause. I said, she's not available to be used as a message. Send it another way. Nia looked at him for a long time. She didn't have an answer for that, and she hated not having an answer. She found the files by accident. She had been in the upper-level corridor because one of the guards had stepped away from his post, and she'd pushed the boundary out of a combination of boredom and that bone-deep need she'd had since childhood to understand the rooms she wasn't supposed to enter. The door to his private office was slightly open. She only meant to look. She found herself inside. The room was organized with the precision of a man who believed control of the environment was the first requirement of control over everything else. One wall was entirely covered in a structured board. Photographs, documents, printed communications, connected by lines and notations in Korean. It was the anatomy of an investigation. She was about to leave. Then she saw her own face. A photograph of her. Taken outside her old apartment building, the one associated with the scholarship program that had collapsed. There were others. Her student registration, her visa application, the name of the institution that had sponsored her. Financial records of the institution. These connected, through lines and notations she couldn't fully read, to other photographs, other women, other records, the same institution. Dates going back almost a year. He had been investigating her, before they ever met. Her legs stopped working properly. She sat down in his chair because standing was suddenly not an option, and she stared at the board, and she rewound every conversation, every interaction, every moment in the lounge, and she understood that she had been walking through a story that had already been in progress. She was still sitting there when the door opened. Tae-Hyun stopped in the doorway. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked something other than controlled. It was brief, a flash of something that might have been dread, and then it was contained. Nia stood up. How long? He didn't ask her what she meant. 7 months, he said. 7 months. She heard herself say the words like she was reading them. You'd been investigating my scholarship program for 7 months before I walked into that lounge. Yes. The meeting, at Obsidian, that was connected to this? A pause. Peripherally. Did you know I was going to be there? The beat that followed that question was its own answer. You knew, she said. You sat at that table and you waited and you watched me and... I didn't arrange for you to be there, he said. I knew you worked there. I wanted to see... What? What did you want to see? He crossed the room and stood several feet from her. When he spoke, something in his voice had changed. The layer of professional control was still there, but underneath it was something raw and real that she hadn't heard before. Her name was Sua, he said. My younger sister. She came to Seoul at 19. She was recruited through a scholarship program, the same kind of fraudulent system. She disappeared into a trafficking network. We found her 8 months later. He stopped. Breath controlled. Eyes steady, but at cost. She didn't survive. Nia felt the world rearrange itself around that sentence. The institution that brought you to Seoul, he continued, is a branch of the same network. The names change. The structure doesn't. I've been dismantling it for 3 years. Your records crossed my desk 7 months ago and I saw the pattern and He paused. I told myself I was monitoring to protect a potential victim. That was the professional reason. And the real reason? He looked at her across the quiet room, and in his eyes was something she had never expected to find in a man like him. The specific exposed grief of someone who had lost something they couldn't get back and had been building an identity around the loss ever since. You look nothing like her, he said quietly, but the situation was identical, and I couldn't look away. Nia stood there and let that settle into her, and it settled like something permanent, like something that was going to change the shape of everything going forward, and the anger was still real and present and legitimate. He had withheld, he had orchestrated, he had not been honest. But underneath the anger was something else now, understanding, the terrible, destabilizing understanding of a person who has glimpsed the grief behind another person's walls and can no longer maintain the convenient fiction that those walls are merely arrogance. She ran anyway. She ran because understanding a wound doesn't automatically mean you should stay in the room with it. Because she had been held in this penthouse for weeks, and the world outside still existed, and she had a life that had been suspended and a future that required her participation. She ran because she was terrified of what she'd felt in that office, and fear has always been the most honest compass. She made it 3 blocks. The men who took her were fast and practiced, not his men, different men, rougher, with a different energy entirely. One moment she was moving through a side street in the rain, the next she was in darkness, hands restrained, moving fast through the city in the back of a vehicle that smelled like oil and rust, nothing like the clean machinery of Tae-Hyun's world. She understood immediately. She had walked out of the cage and straight into the trap. The penthouse had been the safest place in Seoul. The warehouse was near the port, industrial, cold. She could hear water and the distant moan of cargo ships. They tied her to a chair. The man in charge was someone she'd never seen. Middle-aged, sharp-faced, wearing the relaxed expression of someone who understood they were holding leverage. He spoke to her in Korean, then English when she didn't respond. "He'll come for you," the man said. "He always comes. That's the problem with Kang Tae-Hyun." He tilted his head. "He can't help himself when something matters." He asked her questions. She answered none of them. He threatened in specific and creative ways, and she listened to the threats, and she did not perform fear for him because performing fear for him felt like giving him something she refused to give. She thought about Tae-Hyun's face in the office, the controlled grief, the 7 months of investigation, the way he'd told her she was still trying to run from me, in a future that hadn't happened yet, at an airport, with something in his eyes that she hadn't been able to read. Not until now. She understood it now. The lights went out. Complete darkness. Then, from somewhere in the building, far and then close, the sound of systematic violence. Not chaotic. Deliberate. Moving in a direction. The guards outside the room she was in began shouting, and then the shouting became brief, and then it stopped. Silence. The door to the room came off its hinges. Tae-Hyun stood in the opening, blood on his hands, jacket gone. The flat, controlled expression entirely absent, replaced by something she had never seen on him, something rawer and more human, the face of a man who had burned through his own limits to get to this room. Behind him, 3 of his men, moving to clear. He crossed to her, cut the restraints. His hands were steady, but his eyes were not. She stood, and her legs almost didn't hold, and he caught her arm. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice low. "No, I'm—" She stopped, looked at him. "You're covered in blood. Not mine. Are you sure?" "Most of it isn't mine." She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had run an empire of violence and grief and control, who had built walls out of his sister's death and lived inside them so long he'd mistaken them for a home, who had watched her for 7 months because he couldn't save Soo-ah and couldn't stop trying to save the version of the situation he could reach, who had put his body between her and a sniper's window, who had told a room full of dangerous men not to use her as a message. "Let's get out of here," she said. The aftermath was quiet. Not peaceful. Quiet. The specific silence of a storm that has passed and left everything rearranged. She sat in the back of one of his vehicles with her wrists where the restraints had been, and he sat beside her instead of across from her, and the city moved past the windows. When they reached the tower, they went up without speaking. Inside the penthouse, he sat down, not in his usual contained way, positioned for control, but like a person whose body had finally spent everything it had. He sat on the floor near the broken window they'd repaired with temporary glass, and he looked at the city. She sat near him, not beside him, just near. After a long time, he said, I told myself I was protecting you. She waited. I told myself that was enough reason. The professional reason, the right reason. Monitoring a potential victim. Intervening. That was clean. That made sense. A pause. I am very good at clean reasons. I know, she said. The truth is, he stopped, looked at his hands. The blood was still there and he looked at it without flinching. I couldn't let you go. From the first night. I saw you put that tray down and look at me and there was something in it. Some refusal to be reduced. And I have been surrounded for 10 years by people who reduce themselves in my presence, and I had forgotten what it looked like when someone didn't. Nia sat with that. You were wrong to keep things from me, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes? You should have told me? About Sue-ah, about the investigation, about why I was really there. Yes? If you'd told me, I might have stayed willingly. He looked at her then, and in his expression was the specific vulnerability of a man who is not accustomed to realizing, too late, that honesty would have cost less than control. I know, he said. She looked at him, this complicated, dangerous, grief-armored man who had burned down a warehouse to get her back. And she thought, this is not a safe thing to feel. What she felt was not safe, and it was not simple, and it was probably going to make her life significantly more complicated than it had been before she'd slammed a drink onto a table in a lounge full of frightened people. But it was real, and real things, in Nia's experience, were worth more than safe ones. She didn't say any of that. She was not at the point of saying any of that. What she said was, I'm hungry. A beat. Something moved in his face that was almost, genuinely, a smile. I'll have it brought up, he said. 3 weeks later. Incheon International Airport. Terminal 2. International departures. Nia stood at her gate with a single bag and a one-way ticket to London. Not Lagos, not yet, but somewhere new. Somewhere not defined by the life she'd arrived in Seoul to build and the different life she'd found. She needed space. She needed to think about the past months without the man himself in proximity, because thinking clearly about Kang Tae-Hyun while Kang Tae-Hyun was present had proved consistently impossible. Her flight was boarding in 20 minutes. She bought a coffee. She found a seat near the gate. She checked her phone with the specific determined calm of a person who has made a decision and is holding onto it with both hands. Then the gate area shifted. She didn't see it immediately, just felt it. The way you always felt it when enough people in a space recalibrated around a single point of entry. A stillness that started at the edges and moved inward. She looked up. 4 men in dark suits moved through the terminal with the quiet efficiency she now recognized down to her spine. They formed a loose perimeter. People parted. The gate agent paused what she was doing. Slow footsteps. Kang Tae-Hyun walked toward her through the terminal. Perfect suit. Unreadable expression. The overhead lighting catching the planes of his face in a way that was frustratingly, unreasonably precise. He moved at a pace that suggested airports, announcements, boarding times. None of these things applied to him in the way they applied to other people. He stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. All around them, the terminal continued its busy noise, and they were the eye of it. You're still trying to run from me, he said quietly. Nia held his gaze. Her coffee was warm in her hand. The gate announcement echoed overhead. She thought about 7 months and a photograph on a wall. She thought about a switched plate at a long table. She thought about glass exploding inward and a body between her and the window. Already there before she'd even understood the sound. She thought about what she wanted. Not what was safe. What was real. She didn't answer him. She stood up. And when she stood, she was close enough that the distance between them was a decision. And that, Echoverse family, is where the story lives. Not in the resolution, but in the choice. That moment between standing up and deciding which direction to walk. That's the story. That's always the story. If this one stayed with you, if you felt the danger, the tension, the pull of two people who should never have found each other, then you already know what to do. Like this video. Subscribe to Echoverse's stories. Drop a comment below and tell us, should Nia stay or go? Should she walk toward him or walk away? The comment section is yours. We'll see you in the next story.